Date the 28th of April. Jake worked the night shift at the office, a solitary figure surrounded by empty cubicles and the hum of fluorescent lights. Every night without fail he would get up from his desk at exactly 10:55 p.m. A quick break before the final stretch of work. But for Jake it was more than that. It was a ritual. He walked through the long, dimly lit corridor that stretched from his cubicle to the exit. The corridor was silent, the kind of quiet that filled the air with a strange sense of unease. On either side, doors to empty conference rooms lined the walls, their dark interiors resembling voids. Jake's footsteps echoed off the walls as he made his way through, the only sound breaking the stillness. His destination was the office's main door, and beyond that, the small patch of pavement outside where he could enjoy his nightly cigarette. Jake pushed open the heavy metal door, feeling the rush of cool night air on his face. He walked to the edge of the building near the gate, pulled out a cigarette from his pack, and lit it with a practiced flick of his lighter. The small flame briefly illuminated his tired eyes and the stubble on his jaw. He took a deep drag, the familiar burn of smoke filling his lungs and easing his nerves. But tonight, as always, it wasn't just the cigarette he was after. Jake checked his watch. It was nearly 11 p.m. His heart began to beat a little faster in anticipation. He lifted his head and gazed down the street. A faint, sweet scent drifted on the breeze, and he closed his eyes, savoring it. It was a fragrance he had come to know well, one that signaled the arrival of something, or rather someone, extraordinary. At the stroke of 11 she appeared. Jane. She emerged from around the corner with an ethereal grace, her hair flowing softly in the breeze. Jake watched her approach, his heart pounding against his rib cage. She smiled as she always did, a smile so warm, so beautiful it made the world around them seem brighter. Every night she passed him by with that smile, and every night Jake could do nothing but stand there mesmerized. But tonight was different. Tonight he had built up the courage to speak. As she walked by, he swallowed his nerves and called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Hey, what's your name?" Jane stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide with surprise. Slowly her lips curled into a broader smile. "Jane," she replied softly, "nice to finally hear your voice." For the first time they talked. Jake felt an odd mixture of excitement and calm wash over him as Jane's voice filled the air between them. It was soft and melodic, carrying a warmth that seemed to seep into his skin and settle in his chest. Words flowed easily, effortlessly, as though they had slipped into a rhythm known only to them. It was as if they had known each other for lifetimes, their conversation picking up like an old song replayed after years of silence. Every laugh, every glance drew them closer. Jake found himself caught in the glow of her eyes, the way they sparkled under the streetlights. Those eyes were like stars in the darkness, pulling him in, casting a spell he had no desire to break. When she laughed, the sound wrapped around him, filling the night with a warmth that he had long forgotten. It was the kind of laughter that made his heart ache, both joyous and bittersweet. And every time she glanced at him with that little curve of her lips, he felt his insides twist in the most beautiful way. Jane, too, seemed to lose herself in the moment. Her gaze softened each time she looked at him, and her smile grew more genuine, more radiant. There was a lightness to her laugh that hadn't been there before, a melody that hung in the air, lingering even after the sound faded. She caught the subtle hints of his cologne mixed with the scent of cigarette smoke, an odd yet strangely comforting combination that became unmistakably Jake. She couldn't quite understand why, but his presence made her feel safe. Time slipped away from them, the world around blurring into an unimportant backdrop. Hours passed unnoticed, as if the ticking of the clock had ceased to matter. They shared stories, secrets, fragments of their lives, but it was more than just words. It was the way Jake leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers as if she were the most captivating thing in existence, the way his face softened every time she spoke, like he was memorizing every detail of her smile. She felt it too, the undeniable pull, the connection that went beyond mere attraction. It was deeper, more profound, something that needed no explanation. As the conversation deepened, they exchanged glances that spoke of things words could never express. Jake noticed how she would tuck a strand of hair behind her ear whenever she was about to say something personal, her cheeks slightly flushing under his gaze. And Jane, in turn, was fascinated by the way his eyes would light up with every laugh, how his shoulders relaxed when he talked about his childhood, his dreams. There was an unspoken understanding, a mutual affection that blossomed quietly in the space between them. The air around them grew warmer, infused with the mingling scents of night-blooming jasmine and the faint, lingering smell of cigarette smoke. It was as if the world had woven this moment just for them, enveloping them in a cocoon of tranquility. Each glance, each smile was a thread pulling them closer, tightening their bond. In the brief silences that followed their laughter, Jake would find himself simply gazing at her, entranced. He wasn't just listening to her words, he was absorbing the way she moved, the way her eyes would flicker with amusement, the way her lips curved into that perfect, delicate smile. And Jane noticed his gaze, feeling a strange flutter in her chest. His eyes held a warmth, an admiration she hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. She realized she was drawn to him in a way that defied reason, like they had been meant to find each other in the vast expanse of time and space. As they stood there, time seemed to stretch, the night growing deeper and yet brighter around them. In that moment, everything else faded, their worries, their pasts, the world beyond. It was just them, two souls meeting under the stars, unburdened and unguarded. For the first time in so long, they felt alive, connected to someone who saw them, truly saw them. And so, as the hours passed, their bond grew stronger, wrapping around them like an embrace. It was the kind of connection that felt effortless and unconditional, as if the universe had conspired to bring them together in that fleeting moment. Jake could feel his heart swelling with every glance, every laugh they shared. And Jane felt like she was finally home, standing beside this man with the kind eyes and the rough around the edges charm. They didn't need to say it, not yet. The air was heavy with the unspoken truth of their feelings. It was there in the way they looked at each other, in the way their hands almost brushed as they spoke. A promise unfulfilled but understood, that this was the beginning of something more, something that had been waiting to happen for longer than they could comprehend. But then something changed. Out of the corner of his eye, Jake noticed a shadow moving in the distance. A man on a bicycle appeared, lingering in the darkness, his gaze fixed on them. The man's presence was unsettling, his face obscured by shadows. Alarm bells rang in Jake's head. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice barely concealing his worry. "Do you know him?" Jane glanced over, her expression shifting to one of unease. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I've never seen him before." The man continued to watch them, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He rode slowly towards them, stopping a few feet away. Jake moved closer to Jane, shielding her from the stranger's gaze. The man said nothing at first, simply observing, his presence casting a dark shadow over their moment. "You need to walk me home," Jane suddenly said, her voice trembling. "Please, will you?" Of course, Jake replied, feeling an urgent need to protect her. They began walking together, but the man on the bicycle followed, his wheels creaking in the eerie silence of the night. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as they approached Jane's house. However, as they reached her doorstep, Jane froze. She stared at the door, fear etched across her face. She moved forward but stopped, as if an invisible force was keeping her from crossing the threshold. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached for the door handle, only to pull back in frustration. "I can't go in," she choked out, her voice breaking. "Why can't I go inside?" Jake stood there, helpless and confused. He had never seen someone so distressed, so desperate. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. "It's okay," he said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Come back with me to the office. We'll figure this out." Jane nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow and relief. As they walked back to the office building, the man on the bicycle followed them silently. A sense of unease filled the air as they approached the entrance. But as Jake tried to step inside, he suddenly stopped. A wave of confusion washed over him. "Why? Can't I remember the name of this place?" he muttered, staring blankly at the building. They pushed through the doors and walked into the lobby. Jake made his way towards his cubicle but halted abruptly, unable to step into the office area. It was as if an unseen force kept him at bay. He glanced at Jane, who stood beside him, looking just as bewildered. "What's happening?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Unable to find any answers, they stepped back outside, out onto the deserted street. That's when they saw him, the man on the bicycle, waiting patiently in the shadows. He rode up to them slowly, stopping a few feet away. His eyes bore into theirs, piercing through the fog of their confusion. "All you need to do is hold hands," the man said calmly, "and kiss each other." Jake and Jane exchanged hesitant glances, a mixture of fear and hope swirling in their eyes. Slowly they reached out and took each other's hands. Tentatively they leaned in, their lips meeting in a soft, trembling kiss. In that instant a brilliant light erupted from their bodies, illuminating the entire street. It shot up into the sky like twin beams, reaching for the heavens as if they were spotlights from another realm. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light vanished. The street was empty. Jake and Jane were gone. Only the man on the bicycle remained, staring up at the now quiet sky. The truth revealed itself in the silence that followed. Jake had died a year ago in that office, his time of death recorded as 10:50 p.m. He had been found slumped over his desk, his heart giving out under the weight of his exhausting routine. Jane, on the other hand, had suffered a far darker fate. She was abused and eventually killed by her stepfather in the very house she could never enter. Her spirit wandered every night, unable to find peace. They had both died on April the 28th, exactly a year ago, at almost the exact same time. Two souls destined to meet but trapped between worlds, seeking closure in the only way they knew how, through each other. In the end, it was their brief moment of connection that finally set them free. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint smell of cigarette smoke through the empty street. But Jake and Jane were nowhere to be seen. And perhaps, wherever they were now, they had finally found the peace they deserved. Like and subscribe for more stories from beyond.